The Rope of Fear by Mary E. and Thomas W. Hanshaw. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Tomlinson, London. If you know anything of the country of Westmoreland, you will know the chief market town of Merton Shepherd. And if you know Merton Shepherd, you will know there is only one important building in that town besides the massive town hall. And that building is the Westmoreland Union Bank, a private concern well backed by every wealthy magnate in the surrounding district and patronized by everyone from the highest to the lowest degree. Anybody will point the building out to you, firstly because of its imposing exterior, and secondly because everyone in the whole county brings his money to Mr. Naylor Brent, to do with it what he wills. For Mr. Naylor Brent is the manager, and besides being known far and wide for his integrity, his uprightness of purpose, and his strict sense of justice, he acts to the poorer inhabitants of Merton Shepherd as a sort of father confessor in all their troubles, both of a social and a financial character. It was toward the last of September that the big robbery happened, and upon one sunny afternoon at the end of that month, Mr. Naylor Brent was pacing the narrow confines of his handsomely appointed room in the bank, visibly disturbed. That he was waiting the arrival of someone was evident by his frequent glances at the marble clock which stood upon the mantelshelf, and which bore across its base a silver plate upon which were inscribed the names of some 15 or more grateful customers, whose money had passed successfully through his managerial hands. At length the door opened after a discreet knock upon its oaken panels, and an old, bent, and almost decrepit clerk ushered in the portly figure of Mr. Maverick Narkom, Superintendent of Scotland Yard, followed by a heavily built, dull-looking person in navy blue. Mr. Naylor Brent's good-looking, rugged face took on an expression of the keenest relief. "Mr. Narkom himself, this is indeed more than I expected," he said with extended hand. "We had the pleasure of meeting once in London some years ago. Perhaps you have forgotten." Mr. Narkom's bland face wrinkled into a smile of appreciation. "Oh, no, I haven't," he returned pleasantly. "I remember quite distinctly I decided to answer your letter in person, and bring with me one of my best men, friend and colleague, you know, Mr. George Headland." "Pleased to meet you, sir, and if you'll both sit down we can go into the matter at once. That's a comfortable chair over there, Mr. Headland." They seated themselves, and Mr. Narkom, clearing his throat, proceeded in his usual official manner to take the floor. "I understand from headquarters," said he, "that you have had an exceptionally large deposit of banknotes sent up from London for payments in connection with your new canal. Isn't that so, Mr. Brent? I trust the trouble you mentioned in your letter has nothing to do with this money." Mr. Taylor Brent's face paled considerably, and his voice had an anxious note in it when he spoke. "Gad, sir, but it has!" he ejaculated. "That's the trouble itself. Every single banknote is gone. £200,000 is gone, and not a trace of it. Heaven only knows what I'm going to do about it, Mr. Narkom, but that's how the matter stands. Every penny is gone. Gone." Mr. Narkom drew out a red silk handkerchief and wiped his forehead vigorously, a sure sign of nervous excitement, while Mr. Headland exclaimed loudly, "Well, I'm hanged!" "Someone certainly will be," rapped out Mr. Brent sharply, "for not only have the notes vanished, but I've lost the best night watchman I ever had, a good, trustworthy man." "Lost him?" put in Mr. Headland curiously. "What exactly do you mean by that, Mr. Brent? Did he vanish with the notes?" "What? Will Simmons? Never in this world. He's not that kind. The man that offered Will Simmons a bribe to betray his trust would answer for it with his life. A more faithful servant or better fellow never drew breath. No, it's dead he is, Mr. Headland, and I can hardly speak of it yet." I feel so much to blame for putting him on the job at all, but you see we've had a regular series of petty thefts lately, small sums unable to be accounted for, safes opened in the most mysterious manner, and money abstracted, though never any large sums fortunately. Even the clerk's coats had not been left untouched. I've had a constant watch kept, but all in vain, so naturally when this big deposit came to hand on Tuesday morning, I determined that special precautions should be taken at night, and put poor old Simmons down in the vault with the bank's watchdog for company. That was the last time I saw him alive. He was found writhing in convulsions, and by the time that the doctor arrived upon the scene he was dead. The safe was found open, and every note was gone. Bad business indeed, declared Mr. Headland with a shake of the head. No idea as to the cause of death, Mr. Brent. What was the doctor's verdict? Mr. Naylor Brent's face clouded. That's the very dickens of it. He didn't quite know. Said it was evidently a case of poisoning, but was unable to decide further, or to find out what sort of poison, if any, had been used. I see. And what did the local police say? Have they found any clues yet? The manager flushed, and he gave vent to a forced laugh. As a matter of fact, he responded, the local police know nothing about it. I have kept the loss an entire secret until I could call in the help of Scotland Yard. A secret, Mr. Brent, with such a loss? Ejaculated Mr. Narkom. That's surely an unusual course to pursue. When a bank loses such a large sum of money, and in banknotes, the most easily handled commodity in the world, and in addition a mysterious murder takes place, one would naturally expect that the first act would be to call in the officers of the law, that is, unless— I see. Well, it's more than I do, responded Mr. Brent sadly. Do you see any light, however? Hardly that, but it stands to reason that if you are prepared to make good the loss, a course to which there seems no alternative, there is an obvious possibility that you yourself have some faint idea as to who the criminal is, and are anxious that your suspicions should not be verified. Mr. Headland, otherwise Cleek, looked at his friend with considerable admiration shining in his eyes. Beginning to use his old head at last, he thought as he watched the superintendent's keen face. Well, well, it's never too late to mend, anyhow. And then, aloud, exactly my thought, Mr. Narkom. Perhaps Mr. Brent could enlighten us as to his own suspicions, for I am positive that he has some tucked away somewhere in his mind. Jove, if you're not almost supernatural, Mr. Headland, returned the gentleman with a heavy sigh. You have certainly unearthed something which I thought was hidden only in my own soul. That is exactly the reason I have kept silent. My suspicions were I to voice them might drag the person accused still deeper into the mire of his own foolishness. There's Patterson, for instance. He would arrest him on sight, without the slightest compunction. Patterson, threw in Cleek quickly. Patterson, the name's familiar. Don't suppose, though, that it would be the same one. It is a common enough name. Company promoter who made a pile of copper the first year of the war and retired with the swag, to put it brutally. 'Tisn't that chimp, I suppose. The identical man, returned Mr. Brent excitedly. He came here some 5 years ago, bought up Mount Morris Court, a fine place having a view of the whole town, and he has now lately started to run an opposition bank to ours, doing everything in his power to overthrow my position here. It's spite, I believe, against myself as well as George. The young fool had the impudence to ask his daughter's hand, and what was more, ran off with her, and they were married, which increased Patterson's hatred of us both almost to insanity. I see, said Cleek. Who is George? My stepson, Mr. Headland. Unfortunately for me, my late wife's boy by her first marriage. I have to admit it regretfully enough. He was the cause of his mother's death. He literally broke her heart by his wild living, and I was only too glad to give him a small allowance, which however helped him with his unhappy marriage, and hoped to see the last of George Barrington. Cleek twitched an inquiring eyebrow. Unhappy, Mr. Brent, he queried. but I understand from you a moment ago it was a love match." "In the beginning it was purely a question of love, Mr. Headland," responded the manager gravely. "But as you know, when poverty comes in at the door, love sometimes flies out of the window. And from all accounts, the late Miss Patterson never ceases to regret the day she became Mrs. George Barrington. George has been hanging about here this last week or two, and I noticed him trying to renew acquaintance with old Simmons only a day or two ago in the bar of the Rose and Anchor. He was also seen prowling round the bank on Tuesday night. So now you know why I was loath to set the ball rolling. Old man Patterson would lift the sky to get the chance to have that young waster imprisoned, to say nothing of defaming my personal character at the same time. Sooner than that I must endeavour to raise sufficient money by private means to replace the notes. But the death of old Simmons is, of course, another matter. His murderer must and shall be brought to justice, while I still have a penny piece in my pocket." His voice broke suddenly into a harsh sob, and for a few moments his hands covered his face. Then he shook himself free of his emotion. "We will do our best on that score, Mr. Brent," said Mr. Narkom, after a somewhat lengthy silence. "It is a most unfortunate tragedy indeed, almost a dual one might say. But I think you can safely trust yourself in our hands. Eh, Headland?" Cleek bowed his head, while Mr. Brent smiled appreciation of the superintendent's kindly sympathy. "I know I can," he said warmly. "Believe me, Mr. Narkom, and you too, Mr. Headland, I am perfectly content to leave myself with you. But I have my suspicions, and strong ones they are too, and I would not mind laying a bet that Patterson has engineered the whole scheme and is quietly laughing up his sleeve at me." "That's a bold assertion, Mr. Brent," put in Cleek quietly. "But justified by facts, Mr. Headland. He has twice tried to bribe Simmons away from me, and last year offered Colcott, my head clerk, a sum of £5,000 to let him have the list of our clients." "Oh," said Cleek in two different tones. "One of that sort, is he? Not content with a fortune won by profiteering, he must try and ruin others. And having failed to get hold of your list of clients, he tries the bogus theft game and gambles on that. Well, young Barrington may be only a coincidence after all, Mr. Brent. I shouldn't worry too much about him if I were you. Suppose you tell Mr. Narkom and myself the details, right from the beginning, please. When was the murder discovered, and who discovered it?" Mr. Naylor Brent leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily as he polished his gold glasses. "For an affair of such tragic importance, Mr. Headland," he said, "it is singularly lacking in details. There is really nothing more to tell you than at 6 o'clock, when I myself retired from the bank to my private rooms overhead, I left poor Simmons on guard over the safe. At 9 o'clock I was fetched down by the inspector on the beat, who left young Wilson with the body. After that—" Cleek lifted a silencing hand. "One moment," he said. "Who is young Wilson, Mr. Brent, and why should he, instead of the inspector, have been left alone with the body?" "Wilson is one of the cashiers, Mr. Headland, a nice lad, but of no particular education. It seems he found the bank's outer door unlatched and called up the constable on the beat. As luck would have it, the inspector happened along, and down they went into the vaults together. But as to why the inspector left young Wilson with the body instead of sending him up for me, well, frankly, I had never given the thing a thought until now." "I see. Funny thing this chap Wilson should have made straight for the vaults, though. Did he expect a murder or robbery beforehand? Was he acquainted with the fact that the notes were there, Mr. Brent?" "No, he knew nothing whatever about them. No one did. That is, no one but the head clerk, Mr. Colcott, myself, and old Simmons. In bank matters, you know, the less said about such things the better, and—" Mr. Narkom nodded. Very wise indeed," he said approvingly. "One can't be too careful in money matters, and if I may say so, bank pay being none too high, the temptation must sometimes be rather great. I have a couple of nephews in the bank myself." Cleek's eyes suddenly silenced him as though there had been a spoken word. "This Wilson, Mr. Brent," Cleek asked quietly, "is he a young man?" "Oh, quite young. not more than 4 or 25, I should say, came from London with an excellent reference, and so far has given satisfaction, universal favourite with the firm and also with old Simmons himself. I believe the two used sometimes to lunch together and were firm friends. It seems almost a coincidence that the old man should have died in the boy's arms. He made no statement, I suppose, before he died to give an idea of the assassin, but of course you wouldn't know that as you weren't there. As it happens, I do, Mr. Headland. Young Wilson, who is frightfully upset, in fact the shock of the thing has completely shattered his nerves, never very strong at the best of times, says that the old man just rides and mutters something about a rope. Then he fell back dead. A rope? Said Cleek in surprise. Was he tied or bound then? That's just it. There was no sign of anything whatever to do with the rope about him. It was possibly a death delusion or something of the sort. Perhaps the poor old chap was semi-conscious. Undoubtedly, and now just one more question, Mr. Brent, before I tire your patience out. We policemen, you know, are terrible nuisances. What time was it when young Wilson discovered the door of the bank unlatched? About 9:30. I had just noticed my clock striking the half-hour when I was disturbed by the inspector. And wasn't it a bit unusual for a clerk to come back to the bank at that hour, unless he was working overtime? Mr. Naylor Brent's fine head went back with a gesture which conveyed to Cleek the knowledge that he was not in a habit of working any of his employees beyond the given hours. He was doing nothing of the sort, Mr. Headland, he responded a trifle brusquely. Our firm is particularly keen about the question of working hours. Wilson tells me he came back for his watch, which he left behind him, and the door was conveniently unlatched and ready, so he simply fetched in the inspector and took him straight down into the vaults. Didn't get his watch, I suppose?" Mr. Naylor Brent jumped suddenly to his feet, all his self-possession gone for the moment. "Gad, I never thought of that. Hang it, man, you're making a bigger puzzle of it than ever. You're not insinuating that that boy murdered old Simmons, are you? I can't believe that." "I'm not insinuating anything," responded Cleek blandly, "but I have to look at things from every angle there is. When you go downstairs with the inspector, Mr. Brent, did you happen to notice the safe or not?" "Yes, I did. Indeed, I fear that it was my first thought. It was natural, with £200,000 Bank of England notes to be responsible for, and at first I thought everything was all right. Then young Wilson told me he himself had closed the safe door. What are you smiling at, Mr. Headland? It's no laughing matter, I assure you." The queer little one-sided smile, so indicative of the man, travelled for a moment up Cleek's cheek and was gone again in a twinkling. "Nothing," he responded briefly, "just a passing thought. Then you mean to say young Wilson closed the safe? Did he know the notes had vanished? But of course you said he knew nothing of them. But if they were there when he looked in—" His voice trailed off into silence, and he let the rest of the sentence go by default. Mr. Brent's face flushed crimson with excitement. "Why, at that rate," he ejaculated, "the money wasn't stolen until young Wilson sent the inspector up for me, and we let him walk quietly out. You were right, Mr. Headland. If I had only done my duty and told Inspector Corcoran at once—" "Steady, man, steady. I don't say it is so," put in Cleek with a quiet little smile. "I'm only trying to find light." "And making it a dashed sight blacker still, begging your pardon," returned Mr. Brent briskly. "That's as may be, but the devil isn't always as black as he is painted," responded Cleek. "I'd like to see this Wilson, Mr. Brent, unless he is so ill he hasn't been able to attend the office." "Oh, he's back at work today, and I'll have him here in a twinkling." And almost in a twinkling he arrived, a young, slim, pallid youngster, rather given to over-brightness in his choice of ties, and somewhat better dressed than is the lot of most bank clerks. Cleek noted the pearl pin, the well-cut suit he wore, and for a moment his face wore a strange look. Mr. Naylor Brent's brisk voice broke the silence. "These gentlemen are from Scotland Yard, Wilson," he said sharply, "and they want to know just what happened here on Tuesday night. Tell them all you know, please." Young Wilson's pale face went a queer drab shade, like a newly baked bread. He began to tremble visibly. "Happened, sir, happened," he stammered. "How should I know what happened? I only just got there in time, and—" Yes, yes, we know when you got there, Mr. Wilson, said Cleek. But what we want to know is what induced you to go down into the vault when you fetched the inspector. It seemed a rather unnecessary journey, to say the least of it. I heard a cry, at least, right through the closed door of a 9-inch concrete-walled vault, Wilson, struck in Mr. Brent promptly. Simmons had been shut in there by myself, Mr. Headland, and— Shut in, Mr. Brent, shut in, did you say? Then how did Mr. Wilson here and the inspector enter? Young Wilson stretched out his hand imploringly. The door was open, he stammered. I swear it on my honour. And the safe was open, and the notes were gone. What notes? It was Mr. Brent's voice which broke the momentary silence as he realised the significance of the admission. For answer, the young man dropped his face into his shaking hands. Oh, the notes, the £200,000. You may think what you like, sir, but I swear I am innocent. I never touched the money, nor did I touch my— Mr. Simmons. I swear it. I swear it. Don't swear too strongly, or you may have to unswear again, struck in Cleek severely. Mr. Narkom and I would like to have a look at the vault itself and see the body, if you have no objection. Certainly. Wilson, you had better come along with us. We might need you. This way, gentlemen. Speaking, the manager rose to his feet, opened the door of his private office, and proceeded downstairs by way of an equally private staircase to the vaults below. Cleek, Mr. Narkom, and young Wilson, very much agitated at the coming ordeal, brought up the rear. As they passed the door leading into the bank for the use of the clerks, old Colcott came out and paused respectfully in front of the manager. "If you excuse me, sir," he said, "I thought perhaps you might like to see this." He held out a Bank of England £5 note, and Mr. Brent took it and examined it critically. Then a little cry broke from his lips. "A541063, he exclaimed. "Good heavens, Colcott, where did this come from? Who—" Colcott rubbed his old hands together as though he were enjoying a titbit with much satisfaction. "Half an hour ago, sir, Mr. George Barrington brought it in and wanted smaller change." George Barrington! The members of the little party looked at each other in amazement, and Cleek noticed for a moment that young Wilson's tense face relaxed. "Mr. George Barrington, eh?" The curious little one-sided smile travelled up Cleek's cheek and was gone. The party continued their way downstairs, somewhat silenced by this new development. A narrow, dark corridor led to the vault itself, which was by no means a large chamber, but remarkable for the extreme solidity of its building. It was concrete, as most vaults are, and lit only by a single electric light, which, when switched on, shone dully against the grey stone walls. The only ventilation it boasted was provided by means of a row of small holes about an inch in diameter across one wall, that nearest to the passage, and exactly facing the safe. So small were they that it seemed almost as if not even a mouse could get through one of them, should a mouse be so minded. These holes were placed so low down that it was physically impossible to see through them, and although Cleek's eyes noted their appearance there in the vault, he said nothing and seemed to pay them little attention. A speedy glance round the room gave him all the details of it. The safe against the wall, the figure of the old bank servant beside it, sleeping his last sleep, and guarding the vault in death as he had not been able to do in life. Cleek crossed towards him and then stopped suddenly, peering down at what seemed a little twist of paper. "Hello," he said. "Surely you don't allow smoking in the vault, Mr. Brent? Not that it could do much harm, but—" "Certainly not, Mr. Headland," returned the manager warmly. "This is strictly against orders." He glared at young Wilson, who, nervous as he had been before, became obviously more flustered than ever. "I don't smoke, sir," he stammered in answer to that managerial look of accusation. "Glad to hear it." Cleek stroked his cigarette case lovingly inside his pocket, as though in apology for the libel. "But it's my mistake. Not a cigarette end at all, just a twist of paper. Of no account, anyway." He stooped to pick it up, and then, giving his hand a flirt, appeared to have tossed it away. Only Mr. Narkom, used to the ways of his famous associate, saw that he had palmed it into his pocket. Then Cleek crossed the room and stood a moment looking down at the body, lying there huddled and distorted in the death agony that had so cruelly and mysteriously seized it. So this was Will Simmons. Well, if the face is any index to the character, which in 9 cases out of 10 it isn't, then Mr. Naylor Brent's confidence has certainly not been misplaced. A fine, clean, rugged face this, with set lips, a face that would never fail a friend, and never forgive an enemy. Young Wilson, who had stepped up beside Cleek, shivered suddenly as he looked down at the body and closed his eyes. Mr. Brent's voice broke the silence that the sight of death so often brings. "I think," he said quietly, "if you don't mind, gentlemen, I'll get back to my office. There are important matters at stake just now, and if you'll excuse me, it's near closing time, you know, and there are many important matters to see to. Wilson, you stay here with these gentlemen and render any assistance that you can. Show them round if they wish it. You need not resume work today. Anything which you wish to know, please call upon me." "Thanks, we'll remember." Cleek bowed ceremoniously as the manager retreated. "But no doubt Mr. Wilson here will give us all the assistance we require, Mr. Brent. We'll make an examination of the body first and let you know the verdict." The door closed on Mr. Brent's figure, and Cleek and Mr. Narkom and young Wilson were alone with the dead. Cleek went down upon his knees before the still figure and examined it from end to end. The clenched hands were put to the keenest scrutiny, but he passed no comment, only glancing now and again from those same hands to the figure of the young cashier who stood trembling beside him. Convulsions," he finally said softly to himself, and Mr. Narkom watched his face with intense eagerness. "Might be aconite, but how administered?" Again he stood silent, his brain moving swiftly down an avenue of thought, and if the thoughts could have been seen, they should have shown something like this: convulsions, writhing, twisting, tied up in knots of pain, a rope. Suddenly he wheeled swiftly upon Wilson, his face a mask for his emotions. "Look here," he said sternly, "I want you to tell me the exact truth, Mr. Wilson. It's the wisest way when dealing with the police, you know. Are you positively certain Simmons said nothing as to the cause of his death? What exactly were his last words to you?" "I begged him to tell me who it was who had injured him," replied Wilson, in a shaking voice. "But all he could say was, 'The rope, mind the rope of fear, the rope of fear.' And then he was gone. But there was no sign of any rope, Mr. Headland, and I can't imagine what the dear old man was driving at. And now to think he is dead, dead." His voice broke and was silent for a moment. Once again Cleek spoke. "And you saw nothing, heard nothing?" "Well, I hardly know. There was a sound, a faint whisper, reed-like and thin, almost like a long-drawn sigh. I really thought I must have imagined it, and when I listened again it had gone. After that I rushed to the safe and—" "Why did you do that?" "Because he had told me at dinner time about the notes, and made me promise I wouldn't mention it, and I was afraid someone had stolen them." "Is it likely that anyone overheard your conversation then? Where were you lunching?" "In the Rose and Crown." Wilson's voice trembled again as though the actual recalling of the thing terrified him anew. "Simmons and I often had lunch together. There was no one else at our table, and the place was practically empty. The only person was an old Ramajee, the black chap who keeps the Indian bazaar in the town. He's an old inhabitant, but even now hardly understands English, and most of the time he's so drugged with opium that if he did hear he'd never understand. He was certainly blind to the world that lunchtime, because my friend Simmons, noticed it." "Indeed." Cleek stroked his chin thoughtfully for some moments. Then he sniffed the air and uttered a casual remark. "Fond of sweets still, are you, Mr. Wilson? Peppermint drops or aniseed balls, eh?" Mr. Narkom's eyes fairly bulged with amazement, and young Wilson flushed angrily. "I am not such a fool as all that, Mr. Headland," he said quickly. "If I don't smoke, I certainly don't go about sucking candy like a kid. I never cared for 'em as a youngster, and I haven't had any for a cat's age." "What made you ask?" "Nothing, simply my fancy." But nevertheless Cleek continued to sniff, and then suddenly with a little excited sound went down on his hands and knees and began examining the stone floor. "It's not possible, and yet, I must be right," he said softly, getting to his feet at last. "A rope of fear was what he said, wasn't it? A rope of fear." He crossed suddenly to the safe and, bending over it, examined the handle and doors critically, and at that moment Mr. Brent reappeared. Cleek switched round upon his heel and smiled across at him. "Able to spare us a little more of your valuable time, Mr. Brent," he said politely. "Well, I was just coming up. There's nothing really to be gained here. I've been looking over the safe for fingerprints, and there's not much doubt about whose they are. Mr. Wilson here had better come upstairs and tell us exactly what he did with the notes, and—" Young Wilson's face went suddenly grey. He clenched his hands together and breathed hard like a spent runner. "I tell you, they were gone," he cried desperately. "They were gone. I looked for them and didn't find them. They were gone, gone, gone." But Cleek seemed not to take the slightest notice of him, and springing upon his heel, followed in the wake of the manager's broad back, while Wilson perforce had to return with Mr. Narkom. Halfway up the stairs, however, Cleek suddenly stopped and gave vent to a hurried ejaculation. "Silly idiot that I am," he said crossly. "I've left my magnifying glass on top of the safe, and it's the most necessary tool we policemen have. Don't bother to come, Mr. Brent, if you'll just lend me the keys of the vault. Thanks, I'll be right back." It was certainly not much more than a moment when he did return, and the other members of the little party had barely reached the private office when he fairly rushed in after them. There was a look of supreme satisfaction in his eyes. "Here it is," he said, lifting the glass up for all to see. "And look here, Mr. Brent, I changed my mind about discussing the matter any further here. The best thing you can do is to go down in a cab with Mr. Narkom to the police station and get a warrant for this young man's arrest. No, don't speak, Mr. Wilson, I've not finished yet. And take him along with you. I will stay here and just scribble down the facts. It'll save no end of bother, and we can take our man straight up to London with us, under proper arrest. I shan't be more than 10 minutes at the most." Mr. Brent nodded assent. "As you please, Mr. Headland," he said gravely. "We'll go along at once. Wilson, you understand you are to come with us? It's no use trying to get away from it, man. You're up against it now. You'd better just keep a stiff upper lip and face the music. I'm ready, Mr. Narkom." Quietly they took their departure in a hastily found cab, leaving Cleek, the picture of stolid policemenism, with notebook and pencil in hand, busily inscribing what he was pleased to call the facts. Only 10 minutes Cleek had asked for, but it was nearer 20 before he was ushered out of the side entrance of the bank by the old housekeeper, and though perhaps it was only sheer luck that caused him to nearly tumble into the arms of Mr. George Barrington, whom he recognized from the word picture of that gentleman given by Mr. Brent some time before, it was decidedly by arrangement that, after a few careless words on the part of Cleek, Barrington, his face blank with astonishment, accompanied this stranger down to the police station. They found a grim little party waiting for them, but at the sight of Cleek's face, Mr. Narkom started forward and put a hand upon his friend's arm. "What have you found, Headland?" he asked excitedly. "Just what I expected to find," came the triumphant reply. "Now, Mr. Wilson, you are going to hear the end of the story. Do you want to see what I found, gentlemen? Here it is." He fumbled in his big coat pocket for a moment and pulled out a parcel which crackled crisply. "The notes!" "Good God!" It was young Wilson who spoke. "Yes, a very good God, even to sinners, Mr. Wilson. We don't always deserve all the goodness we get, you know." Cleek went on. "The notes are found, you see, the notes, you murderer, you despicable thief, the notes which were entrusted to your care by the innocent people who pinned their faith on you." Speaking, he leaped forward, past the waiting inspector and Mr. Narkom, past the shabby, down-at-heel figure of George Barrington, past the slim, shaking Wilson, and straight at the substantial figure of Mr. Naylor Brent, as he stood leaning with one arm upon the inspector's high desk. So surprising, so unexpected was the attack, that this victim was overpowered, and the bracelet snapped upon his wrist before anyone present had begun to realize exactly what had happened. Then Cleek rose to his feet. "What's that, Inspector?" he said in answer to a hurriedly spoken query. "A mistake?" "Oh dear, no. No mistake whatever. Our friend here understands that quite well. Thought you'd have escaped with the 200,000 and left your confederate to bear the brunt of the whole thing, did you? Or else young Wilson here, whom you'd so terrorized. A very pretty plot indeed. Only Hamilton Cleek happened to come along instead of Mr. George Headland and show you a thing or two about plots. Hamilton Cleek? The name fell from every pair of lips, and even Brent himself stared at the wizard, whom all the world knew, and who had unfortunately crossed his path when he least wanted him. Yes, Hamilton Cleek, gentlemen, Cleek of Scotland Yard, and a very good thing for you, Mr. Wilson, that I happened to come along. Things look very black for you, you know, and those beastly nerves of yours made it worse. And if it hadn't been for this cad's confederate—" "Confederate, Mr. Cleek," put in Wilson shakily. I don't understand. Who could have been his confederate?" "None other than old Ramajee," responded Cleek. "You'll find him drugged as usual in the Rose and Crown. I seen him there only a while ago. But now he is minus a constant companion of his, and here is the actual murderer." He put his hand into another capacious pocket and drew forth the smallest glass box. "The rope of fear, gentlemen," he said quietly, "a vicious little rattler of the most deadly sort. And it won't be long before that gentleman there becomes acquainted with another sort of rope. Take him away, Inspector. The bare sight of him hurts an honest man's eyes." And they took him away forthwith, a writhing, furious thing, utterly transformed from the genial personality which had for so long swindled and outwitted a trusting public. As the door closed upon them, Cleek turned to young Wilson and held out his hand. "I'm sorry to have accused you as I did," he said softly with a little smile, "but that is a policeman's way, you know. Strategy is part of the game, though it was a poor trick of mine to cause you additional pain. You must forgive me. I don't doubt the death of your father was a great shock, although you tried manfully to conceal the relationship. No doubt it was his wish, not yours." A sudden transformation came over Wilson's pale, haggard face. It was like the sun shining after a heavy storm. "You knew," he said, over and over again. "You knew? Oh, Mr. Cleek, now I can speak out at last. Father always made me promise to be silent. He wanted me to be a gentleman, and he'd spent every penny he possessed to get me well enough educated to enter the bank. He was mad for money, mad for anything which was going to better my position, and I was afraid when he told me about the notes he might be tempted. Oh, it was dreadful of me, I know, to think of it, but I knew he doted upon me. I was afraid he might try and take one or two of them, hoping they wouldn't be missed out of so great an amount. You see, we've been in money difficulties and were still paying my college fees off after all this time. So I went back to keep watch with him and found him dying. Though how you knew—" His voice trailed off into silence, and Cleek smiled kindly. "By the identical shape of your hands, my boy. I never saw two pairs of hands so much alike in all my life. And then your agitation made me risk the guess. What's that, Inspector? How was the murder committed, and what did this little rattler have to do with it?" "Well, quite simple. The snake was put in the safe with the notes, and a trail of aniseed, of which snakes are very fond, you know, laid from there to the foot of old Simmons. The safe door was left ajar, though in the half-dark the old man certainly never noticed it. I found all this out from those few words of Wilson's about the rope, and from his having heard a reed-like sound. I had to do some hard thinking, I can tell you. When I went downstairs again, Mr. Narcombe, after my magnifying glass, I turned down poor Simmons' sock and found the mark I expected. The snake had crawled up his leg and struck home. Why did I suspect Mr. Brent? Well, it was obvious almost from the very first, for he was so anxious to throw suspicion upon Mr. Barrington here and Wilson, with Patterson thrown in for good measure. Then again it was certain that no one else would have been allowed into the vault by Simmons, much less to go to the safe itself and open it with the keys. That he did go to the safe was apparent by the fingerprints on it. As they too smelt of aniseed, the whole thing began to look decidedly funny. The trail of aniseed led straight up to where Simmons lay, so I can only suppose that after Brent released the snake, the trail, of course, having been laid beforehand when he was alone, Brent must have stood and waited until he saw it actually strike. And how did I know that, Mr. Wilson? Well, he smoked a cigarette there. Anyhow, the stub I found bore the same name as those in his box, and it was smoked identically the same way as a couple which lay in his ashtray. I could only conclude that he was waiting for something to happen, and as the snake struck, he grabbed up the bundle of notes, quite forgetting to close the safe door, and rushed out of the vault. Ramagee was in the corridor outside and probably whistled the snake back through the ventilating holes near the floor, instead of venturing near the body himself. You remember you heard the sound of that pipe, Mr. Wilson. Ramagee probably made his escape while the inspector was upstairs. Unfortunately for him, he ran right into Mr. George Barrington here, and when, as he tells me, he later told Brent about seeing Ramagee, well, the whole thing became as plain as a pikestaff. Yes, put in George Barrington excitedly, taking out the tale in his weak, rather silly voice. My stepfather refused to believe me and gave me £20 in notes to go away. I suppose he didn't notice they were the same as the stolen ones. I changed one of them at the bank this morning, but I had no idea how important they were until I knocked into Mr. Cleek here, and he made me come along with him. Mr. Narkom looked at Cleek, and Cleek looked at Mr. Narkom, and the blank wonder in the superintendent's eyes caused him to smile. "Another feather in the cap of foolish old Scotland Yard, isn't it?" he said. "Time we made tracks, I think. Coming our way, Mr. Wilson? We'll see you back home if you like. You're too upset to go on alone. Good afternoon, Inspector, and good-bye. I'll leave the case with you. It's safe enough in your hands, but if you take my tip, you'll put that human beast in as tight a lock-up as the station affords." Then he linked one arm in Mr. Narkom's and the other arm in that of the admiring and wholly speechless Wilson, and went out into the sunshine. End of The Rope of Fear by Mary E. and Thomas W. Hanshaw.
Someday, from While the Billy Boils, by Henry Lawson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. Someday, by Henry Lawson. The two travelers had yarned late in their camp, and the moon was getting low down through the mulga. Mitchell's mate had just finished a rather racy yarn, but it seemed to fall flat on Mitchell. He was in a sentimental mood. He smoked a while, and thought, and then said, there was one little girl that I was properly stuck on. She came to our place on a visit to my sister. I think she was the best little girl that ever lived, and about the prettiest. She was just 18 and didn't come up to my shoulder, the biggest blue eyes you ever saw, and she had hair that reached down to her knees, and so thick you couldn't span it with your two hands, brown and glossy, and her skin was like lilies and roses. Of course, I never thought she'd look at a rough, ugly, ignorant brute like me, and I used to keep out of her way and act a little stiff towards her. I didn't want the others to think I had gone on her, because I knew they'd laugh at me, and maybe she'd laugh at me more than all. She would come and talk to me and sit near me at the table, but I thought that was on account of her good nature, and she pitied me because I was such a rough, awkward chap. I was gone on that girl, and no joking, and I felt quite proud to think she was a countrywoman of mine. But I wouldn't let her know that, for I felt sure she'd only laugh. Well, things went on till I got an offer of 2 or 3 years' work on a station up near the border, and I had to go, for I was hard up. Besides, I wanted to get away. Stopping round where she was only made me miserable. The night I left, they were all down at the station to see me off, including the girl I was gone on. When the train was ready to start, she was standing away by herself on the dark end of the platform, and my sister kept nudging me and winking and fooling around, but I didn't know what she was driving at. At last she said, "Go and speak to her, you noodle. Go and say good-bye to Edie." So I went up to where she was, and when the others turned their backs, "Well, good-bye, Miss Brown," I said, holding out my hand. "I don't suppose I'll ever see you again, for the Lord knows when I'll be back. Thank you for coming to see me off." Just then she turned her face to the light, and I could see she was crying. She was trembling all over. Suddenly she said, "Jack, Jack," just like that, and held her arms up like this. Mitchell was speaking in a tone of voice that didn't belong to him, and his mate looked up. Mitchell's face was solemn and his eyes were fixed on the fire. "I suppose you gave her a big hug then, and a kiss?" asked the mate. "I suppose so," snapped Mitchell. "There is some things a man doesn't want to joke about. Well, I think we'll shove on one of the billies and have a drink of tea before we turn in." "I suppose," said Mitchell's mate as they drank their tea, "I suppose you'll go back and marry her some day." "Some day. That's it. It looks like it, doesn't it? We all say 'some day.' I used to say it 10 years ago, and look at me now. I have been knocking around for 5 years, and the last 2 years constant on the track, and no show of getting off it unless I go for good. And what have I got for it? I look like going home and getting married, without a penny in my pocket, or a rag to my back scarcely, and no show of getting them. I swore I'd never go back home without a check, and, what's more, I never will. But the check days are past. Look at that boot. If we were down among the settled district, we'd be called tramps and beggars, and what's the difference? I've been a fool, I know, but I paid for it, and now there's nothing for it but to tramp, tramp, tramp for your tucker, and keep tramping till you get old and careless and dirty, and older and more careless and dirtier, and you get used to the dust and the sand and the heat and the flies and the mosquitoes, just as a bullock does, and lose ambition and hope and get contented with this animal life like a dog, until your swag seems part of yourself, and you'd be lost and uneasy and light-shouldered without it, and you don't care a damn if you ever get work again, or live like a Christian, and you go on like this till the spirit of a bullock takes the place of the heart of a man. Who cares? If we hadn't found the track yesterday, we might have lain and rotted in that lignum, and no one would have been any the wiser, or sorrier. Who knows? Somebody might have found us in the end, but it mightn't have been worth his while to go out of his way and report us. Damn the world, say I. He smoked for a while in savage silence. Then he knocked the ashes out of his pipe, felt for his tobacco with a sigh, and said, "Well, I am a bit out of sorts tonight. I've been thinking. I think we'd best turn in, old man. We've got a long, dry stretch before us tomorrow." They rolled out their swags on the sand, lay down, and wrapped themselves in their blankets. Mitchell covered his face with a piece of calico, because the moonlight and wind kept him awake. The End of Some Day by Henry Lawson.
The Stranger's Latchkey by R. Austin Freeman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Stranger's Latchkey. The contrariety of human nature is a subject that has given a surprising amount of occupation to makers of proverbs and to those moral philosophers who make it their province to discover and expound the glaringly obvious. And especially they have been concerned to enlarge upon that form of perverseness which engenders dislike of things offered under compulsion, and arouses desire of them as soon as their attainment becomes difficult or impossible. They assure us that a man who has had a given thing within his reach and put it by, will, as soon as it is beyond his reach, find it the one thing necessary and desirable. Even as the domestic cat which has turned disdainfully from the preferred saucer may presently be seen with her head jammed hard in the milk-jug, or secretly and with horrible relish slaking her thirst at the scullery sink. To this peculiarity of the human mind was due, no doubt, the fact that no sooner had I abandoned the clinical side of my profession in favour of the legal, and taken up my abode in the chambers of my friend, Thorndyke, the famous medico-legal expert, to act as his assistant or junior, than my former mode of life, that of a locum tenens, or minder of other men's practices, which had, when I was following it, seemed intolerably irksome, now appeared to possess many desirable features, and I found myself occasionally hankering to sit once more by the bedside, to puzzle out the perplexing train of symptoms, and to wield that power, the greatest after all, possessed by man, the power to banish suffering and ward off the approach of death itself. Hence it was that on a certain morning of the long vacation I found myself installed at the Larches, Burling, in full charge of the practice of my old friend Dr. Hanshaw, who was taking a fishing holiday in Norway. I was not left desolate, however, for Mrs. Hanshaw remained at her post, and the roomy, old-fashioned house accommodated 3 visitors in addition. One of these was Dr. Hanshaw's sister, a Mrs. Haldane, the widow of a wealthy Manchester cotton factor. The second was her niece by marriage, Miss Lucy Haldane, a very handsome and charming girl of 23, while the third was no less a person than Master Fred, the only child of Mrs. Haldane, and a strapping boy of 6. "It is quite like old times, and very pleasant old times, to see you sitting at our breakfast table, Dr. Jervis." With these gracious words and a friendly smile, Mrs. Hanshaw handed me my teacup. I bowed. "The highest pleasure of the altruist," I replied, "is in contemplating the good fortune of others." Mrs. Haldane laughed. "Thank you," she said. "You are quite unchanged, I perceive. Still as suave and shall I say, oleaginous?" "No, please don't," I exclaimed in a tone of alarm. "Then I won't. But what does Dr. Thorndyke say to this backsliding on your part? How does he regard this relapse from medical jurisprudence to common general practice?" "Thorndyke," said I, "is unmoved by any catastrophe, and he not only regards the decline and fall off of the medical jurist with philosophic calm, but he even favours the relapse, as you call it. He thinks it may be useful to me to study the application of medico-legal methods to general practice." "That sounds rather unpleasant, for the patients, I mean," remarked Miss Haldane. "Very," agreed her aunt. "Most cold-blooded. What sort of man is Dr. Thorndyke? I feel quite curious about him. Is he at all human, for instance?" "He is entirely human," I replied, "the accepted tests of humanity being, as I understand, the habitual adoption of the erect posture in locomotion, and the relative position of the end of the thumb—" "I don't mean that," interrupted Mrs. Haldane. "I mean human in things that matter." "I think those things matter," I rejoined. "Consider, Mrs. Haldane, what would happen if my learned colleague were to be seen in wig and gown, walking towards the law courts in any posture other than the erect. It would be a public scandal." "Don't talk to him, Mabel," said Mrs. Hanshaw. "He is incorrigible. What are you going to do with yourself this morning, Lucy?" Miss Haldane, who had hastily set down her cup to laugh at my imaginary picture of Dr. Thorndyke in the character of a quadruped, considered a moment. "I think I shall sketch that group of birches at the end of Bradham Wood," she said. "Then, in that case," said I can carry your traps for you, for I have to see a patient in Bradham." "He is making the most of his time," remarked Mrs. Haldane maliciously to my hostess. "He knows that when Mr. Winter arrives he will retire into the extreme background." Douglas Winter, whose arrival was expected in the course of the week, was Miss Haldane's fiancé. Their engagement had been somewhat protracted, and was likely to be more so unless one of them received some unexpected accession of means; for Douglas was a subaltern in the Royal Engineers, living, with great difficulty, on his pay, while Lucy Haldane subsisted on an almost invisible allowance left her by an uncle. I was about to reply to Mrs. Haldean when a patient was announced, and, as I finished my breakfast, I made my excuses and left the table. Half an hour later, when I started along the road to the village of Bradham, I had two companions. Master Freddy had joined the party, and he disputed with me the privilege of carrying the traps, with the result that a compromise was effected, by which he carried the camp stool, leaving me in possession of the easel, the bag, and a large bound sketching book. "Where are you going to work this morning?" I asked, when we had trudged on some distance. "Just off the road to the left there, at the edge of the wood, not very far from the house of the mysterious stranger." She glanced at me mischievously as she made this reply, and chuckled with delight when I rose at the bait. "What house do you mean?" I inquired. "Ha!" she exclaimed, "the investigator of mysteries is aroused. He saith, Ha! Ha! amidst the trumpets. He smelleth the battle afar off." "Explain instantly," I commanded, "or I drop your sketch-book into the very next puddle." "You terrify me," said she, "but I will explain. Only there isn't any mystery except to the bucolic mind. The house is called Lavender Cottage, and it stands alone in the fields behind the wood. A fortnight ago it was let furnished to a stranger named Whitelock, who has taken it for the purpose of studying the botany of the district, and the only really mysterious thing about him is that no one has seen him. All arrangements with the house agent were made by letter, and as far as I can make out, none of the local tradespeople supply him, so he must get his things from a distance, even his bread, which really is rather odd. Now say I am an inquisitive, gossiping country bumpkin." "I was going to," I answered, "but it is no use now." She relieved me of her sketching appliances with pretended indignation, and crossed into the meadow, leaving me to pursue my way alone; and when I presently looked back, she was setting up her easel and stool, gravely assisted by Freddy. My round, though not a long one, took up more time than I had anticipated, and it was already past the luncheon hour when I passed the place where I had left Miss Haldean. She was gone, as I had expected, and I hurried homewards, anxious to be as nearly punctual as possible. When I entered the dining room, I found Mrs. Haldean and our hostess seated at the table, and both looked up at me expectantly. "Have you seen Lucy?" the former inquired. "No," I answered. "Hasn't she come back? I expected to find her here. She had left the wood when I passed just now." Mrs. Haldean knitted her brows anxiously. "It is very strange," she said, "and very thoughtless of her. Freddy will be famished." I hurried over my lunch, for 2 fresh messages had come in from outlying hamlets, effectually dispelling my visions of a quiet afternoon; and as the minutes passed without bringing any signs of the absentees, Mrs. Haldean became more and more restless and anxious. At length her suspense became unbearable. She rose suddenly, announcing her intention of cycling up the road to look for the defaulters; but as she was moving towards the door, it burst open, and Lucy Haldean staggered into the room. Her appearance filled us with alarm. She was deadly pale, breathless, and wild-eyed, her dress was draggled and torn, and she trembled from head to foot. "Good God, Lucy!" gasped Mrs. Haldean. "What has happened? And where is Freddy?" she added in a sterner tone. "He is lost!" replied Miss Haldean in a faint voice, and with a catch in her breath. "He strayed away while I was painting. I have searched the wood through, and called to him, and looked in all the meadows. Oh, where can he have gone?" Her sketching kit, with which she was loaded, slipped from her grasp and rattled on the floor, and she buried her face in her hands and sobbed hysterically. "And you have dared to come back without him?" exclaimed Mrs. Haldean. "I was getting exhausted. I came back for help," was the faint reply. "Of course she was exhausted," said Mrs. Hanshaw. "Come, Lucy, come, Mabel, don't make mountains out of molehills. The little man is safe enough. We shall find him presently, or he will come home by himself. Come and have some food, Lucy." Miss Haldean shook her head. "I can't, Mrs. Hanshaw. Really, I can't," she said, and seeing that she was in a state of utter exhaustion, I poured out a glass of wine and made her drink it. Mrs. Haldean darted from the room and returned immediately, putting on her hat. "You have got to come with me and show me where you lost him," she said. "She can't do that, you know," I said rather brusquely. "She will have to lie down for the present. But I know the place, and will cycle up with you." "Very well," replied Mrs. Haldean. "That will do. What time was it," she asked, turning to her niece, "when you lost the child? And which way—" She paused abruptly, and I looked at her in surprise. She had suddenly turned ashen and ghastly. Her face had set like a mask of stone, with parted lips and staring eyes that were fixed in horror on her niece. There was a deathly silence for a few seconds. Then, in a terrible voice, she demanded, "What is that on your dress, Lucy?" And after a pause, her voice rose to a shriek. "What have you done to my boy?" I glanced in astonishment at the dazed and terrified girl, and then I saw what her aunt had seen: a good-sized bloodstain halfway down the front of her skirt, and another smaller one on her right sleeve. The girl herself looked down at the sinister patch of red, and then up at her aunt. "It looks like blood," she stammered. "Yes, it is, I think. Of course it is. He struck his nose, and it bled." "Come," interrupted Mrs. Haldean, "let us go." And she rushed from the room, leaving me to follow. I lifted Miss Haldean, who was half fainting with fatigue and agitation, onto the sofa, and, whispering a few words of encouragement into her ear, turned to Mrs. Hanshaw. "I can't stay with Miss Haldean," I said. "There are 2 visits to be made at Redworth. Will you send the dog-cart up the road, with somebody to take my place?" "Yes," she answered. "I will send Giles, or come myself if Lucy is fit to be left." I ran to the stables for my bicycle, and as I pedalled out into the road I could see Mrs. Haldean already far ahead, driving her machine at frantic speed. I followed at a rapid pace, but it was not until we approached the commencement of the wood, when she slowed down somewhat, that I overtook her. "This is the place," I said, as we reached the spot where I had parted from Miss Haldean. We dismounted and wheeled our bicycles through the gate, and laying them down beside the hedge, crossed the meadow and entered the wood. It was a terrible experience, and one that I shall never forget. The white-faced, distracted woman tramping in her flimsy house-shoes over the rough ground, bursting through the bushes regardless of the thorny branches that dragged at skin and hair and dainty clothing, and sending forth from time to time a tremulous cry, so dreadfully pathetic in its mingling of terror and coaxing softness, that a lump rose in my throat, and I could barely keep my self-control. "Freddie, Freddie boy, Mummy's here, darling." The wailing cry sounded through the leafy solitude, but no answer came save the whir of wings or the chatter of startled birds. But even more shocking than that terrible cry, more disturbing and eloquent with dreadful suggestion, was the way in which she peered, furtively, but with fearful expectation, among the roots of the bushes, or halted to gaze upon every molehill and hummock, every depression or disturbance of the ground. As we stumbled on for a while, with never a word spoken, until we came to a beaten track or footpath leading across the wood. Here I paused to examine the footprints, of which several were visible in the soft earth, though none seemed very recent. But, proceeding a little way down the track, I perceived, crossing it, a set of fresh imprints, which I recognised at once as Miss Haldean's. She was wearing, as I knew, a pair of brown golf boots, with rubber pads in their leather soles, and the prints made by them were unmistakable. "Miss Haldean crossed the path here," I said, pointing to the footprints. "Don't speak of her before me," exclaimed Mrs. Haldean, but she gazed eagerly at the footprints nevertheless, and immediately plunged into the wood to follow the tracks. "You are very unjust to your niece, Mrs. Haldean," I ventured to protest. She halted and faced me with an angry frown. "You don't understand," she exclaimed. "You don't know, perhaps, that if my poor child is really dead, Lucy Haldean will be a rich woman, and may marry tomorrow if she chooses?" "I did not know that," I answered, "but if I had, I should have said the same." "Of course you would," she retorted bitterly. "A pretty face can muddle any man's judgment." She turned away abruptly to resume her pursuit, and I followed in silence. The trail which we were following zigzagged through the thickest part of the wood, but its devious windings eventually brought us out onto an open space on the farther side. Here we at once perceived traces of another kind. A litter of dirty rags, pieces of paper, scraps of stale bread, bones and feathers with hoof marks, wheel ruts, and the ashes of a large wood fire pointed clearly to a gipsy encampment recently broken up. I laid my hand on the heap of ashes and found it still warm, and on scattering it with my foot, a layer of glowing cinders appeared at the bottom. "These people have only been gone an hour or two," I said. "It would be well to have them followed without delay." A gleam of hope shone on the drawn white face, as the bereaved mother caught eagerly at my suggestion. "Yes," she exclaimed breathlessly, "she may have bribed them to take him away. Let us see which way they went." We followed the wheel tracks down to the road, and found that they turned towards London. At the same time, I perceived the dog-cart in the distance, with Mrs. Hanshaw standing beside it, and, as the coachman observed me, he whipped up his horse and approached. "I shall have to go," I said, "but Mrs. Hanshaw will help you to continue the search." "And you will make inquiries about the gipsies, won't you?" she said. I promised to do so, and as the dog-cart now came up, I climbed to the seat and drove off briskly up the London road. The extent of a country doctor's round is always an unknown quantity. On the present occasion I picked up 3 additional patients, and as one of them was a case of incipient pleurisy, which required to have the chest strapped, and another was a neglected dislocation of the shoulder, a great deal of time was taken up. Moreover, the gipsies, whom I ran to earth on Rebworth Common, delayed me considerably, though I had to leave the rural constable to carry out the actual search, and, as a result, the clock of Burling Church was striking 6 as I drove through the village on my way home. I got down at the front gate, leaving the coachman to take the dog-cart round, and walked up the drive; and my astonishment may be imagined when, on turning the corner, I came suddenly upon the inspector of the local police in earnest conversation with no less a person than John Thorndyke. "What on earth has brought you here?" I exclaimed, my surprise getting the better of my manners. "The ultimate motive force," he replied, "was an impulsive lady named Mrs. Haldean. She telegraphed for me in your name." "She oughtn't to have done that," I said. "Perhaps not, but the ethics of an agitated woman are not worth discussing, and she has done something much worse. She has applied to the local J.P., a retired Major General, and our gallant and unlearned friend has issued a warrant for the arrest of Lucy Haldean on the charge of murder." "But there has been no murder!" I exclaimed. "That," said Thorndyke, "is a legal subtlety that he does not appreciate. He has learned his law in the orderly room, where the qualifications to practice are an irritable temper and a loud voice. However, the practical point is, Inspector, that a warrant is irregular. You can't arrest people for hypothetical crimes." The officer drew a deep breath of relief. He knew all about the irregularity, and now joyfully took refuge behind Thorndyke's great reputation. When he departed, with a brief note from my colleague to the General, Thorndyke slipped his arm through mine, and we strolled towards the house. "This is a grim business, Jervis," said he. "That boy has got to be found for everybody's sake. Can you come with me when you have had some food?" "Of course I can. I have been saving myself all the afternoon with a view to continuing the search." "Good," said Thorndyke. "Then come in and feed." A nondescript meal, half tea and half dinner, was already prepared, and Mrs. Hanshaw, grave but self-possessed, presided at the table. "Mabel is still out with Giles, searching for the boy," she said. "You have heard what she has done?" I nodded. "It was dreadful of her," continued Mrs. Hanshaw. "She is half mad, poor thing. You might run up and say a few kind words to poor Lucy while I make the tea." I went up at once and knocked at Miss Haldean's door, and, being bidden to enter, found her lying on the sofa, red-eyed and pale, the very ghost of the merry laughing girl who had gone out with me in the morning. I drew up a chair and sat down by her side, and as I took the hand she held out to me, she said, "It is good of you to come and see a miserable wretch like me. And Jane has been so sweet to me, Dr. Jervis. But Aunt Mabel thinks I have killed Freddie. You know she does. And it was really my fault that he was lost. I shall never forgive myself." She burst into a passion of sobbing, and I proceeded to chide her gently. "You are a silly little woman," I said, "to take this nonsense to heart as you are doing. Your aunt is not responsible just now, as you must know, and when we bring the boy home, she shall make you a handsome apology. I will see to that." She pressed my hand gratefully, and as the bell now rang for tea, I bade her have courage and went downstairs. "You need not trouble about the practice," said Mrs. Hanshaw, as I concluded my lightning repast, and Thorndyke went off to get our bicycles. "Dr. Simons has heard of our trouble, and has called to say that he will take anything that turns up, so we shall expect you when we see you." "How do you like Thorndyke?" I asked. "He is quite charming," she replied enthusiastically. "So tactful and kind, and so handsome too. You didn't tell us that. But here he is. Good-bye, and good luck." She pressed my hand, and I went out into the drive, where Thorndyke and the coachman were standing with 3 bicycles. "I see you have brought your outfit," I said as we turned into the road, for Thorndyke's machine bore a large canvas-covered case strapped on with a strong bracket. "Yes, there are many things that we may want on a quest of this kind. How did you find Miss Haldean?" "Very miserable, poor girl. By the way, have you heard anything about her pecuniary interest in the child's death?" "Yes," said Thorndyke. "It appears that the late Mr. Haldean used up all his brains on his business, and had none left for the making of his will, as often happens. He left almost the whole of his property, about £80,000, to his son, the widow to have a life interest in it. He also left to his late brother's daughter, Lucy, £50 a year, and to his surviving brother, Percy, who seems to have been a good-for-nothing, 100 a year for life. But, and here is the utter folly of the thing, if the son should die, the property was to be equally divided between the brother and the niece, with the exception of 500 a year for life for the widow. It was an insane arrangement." "Quite," I agreed. "And a very dangerous one for Lucy Haldean, as things are at present." "Very. Especially if anything should have happened to the child." "What are you going to do now?" I inquired, seeing that Thorndyke rode on as if with a definite purpose. "There is a footpath through the wood," he replied. "I want to examine that. And there is a house behind the wood which I should like to see." "The house of the mysterious stranger," I suggested. "Precisely. Mysterious and solitary strangers invite inquiry." We drew up at the entrance to the footpath, leaving Willett the coachman in charge of the 3 machines, and proceeded up the narrow track. As we went, Thorndyke looked back at the prints of our feet, and nodded approvingly. "This soft loam," he remarked, "yields beautifully clear impressions, and yesterday's rain has made it perfect." We had not gone far when we perceived a set of footprints which I recognised, as did Thorndyke also, for he remarked, "Miss Haldean, running and alone." Presently we met them again, crossing in the opposite direction, together with the prints of small shoes with very high heels. "Mrs. Haldean on the track of her niece," was Thorndyke's comment, and a minute later we encountered them both again, accompanied by my own footprints. "The boy does not seem to have crossed the path at all," I remarked as we walked on, keeping off the track itself to avoid confusing the footprints. "We shall know when we have examined the whole length," replied Thorndyke, plodding on with his eyes on the ground. "Ha! Here is something new," he added, stopping short and stooping down eagerly. "A man with a thick stick. A smallish man, rather lame. Notice the difference between the 2 feet, and the peculiar way in which he uses his stick? Yes, Jervis, there is a great deal to interest us in these footprints. Do you notice anything very suggestive about them?" "Nothing but what you have mentioned," I replied. "What do you mean?" "Well, first there is the very singular character of the prints themselves, which we will consider presently. You observe that this man came down the path, and at this point turned off into the wood. Then he returned from the wood and went up the path again. The imposition of the prints makes that clear. But now look at the 2 sets of prints and compare them. Do you notice any difference?" "The returning footprints seem more distinct, better impressions." "Yes, they are noticeably deeper. But there is something else." He produced a spring tape from his pocket and took half a dozen measurements. "You see," he said, "the first set of footprints have a stride of 21 inches from heel to heel. A short stride, but he is a smallish man, and lame. The returning ones have a stride of only 19½ inches. Hence the returning footprints are deeper than the others, and the steps are shorter. What do you make of that?" "It would suggest he was carrying a burden when he returned," I replied. "Yes, and a heavy one, to make that difference in the depth. I think I will get you to go and fetch Willett and the bicycles." I strode off down the path to the entrance, and taking possession of Thorndyke's machine, with its precious case of instruments, bade Willett follow with the other 2. When I returned, my colleague was standing with his hands behind him, gazing with intense preoccupation at the footprints. He looked up sharply as we approached, and called out to us to keep off the path if possible. "Stay here with the machines, Willett," said he. "You and I, Jervis, must go and see where our friend went to when he left the path, and what was the burden that he picked up." We struck off into the wood, where last year's dead leaves made the footprints almost undistinguishable, and followed the faint double track for a long distance between the dense clumps of bushes. Suddenly my eye caught, beside the double trail, a 3rd row of tracks, smaller in size and closer together. Thorndyke had seen them too, and already his measuring tape was in his hand. 11½ inches to the stride," said he. "That will be the boy, Jervis. But the light is getting weak. We must press on quickly, or we shall lose it." Some 50 yards farther on, the man's tracks ceased abruptly, but the small ones continued alone, and we followed them as rapidly as we could in the fading light. "There can be no reasonable doubt that these are the child's tracks," said Thorndyke, "but I should like to find a definite footprint to make the identification absolutely certain." A few seconds later he halted with an exclamation, and stooped on one knee. A little heap of fresh earth from the surface burrow of a mole had been thrown up over the dead leaves, and fairly planted on it was the clean and sharp impression of a diminutive foot, with a rubber heel showing a central star. Thorndyke drew from his pocket a tiny shoe, and pressed it on the soft earth beside the footprint, and when he raised it, the second impression was identical with the first. "The boy had 2 pairs of shoes exactly alike," he said, "so I borrowed one of the duplicate pair." He turned and began to retrace his steps rapidly, following our own fresh tracks, and stopping only once to point out the place where the unknown man had picked the child up. When we regained the path, we proceeded without delay until we emerged from the wood within 100 yards of the cottage. "I see Mrs. Haldean has been here with Giles," remarked Thorndyke, as he pushed open the garden gate. "I wonder if they saw anybody." He advanced to the door, and having first rapped with his knuckles, and then kicked at it vigorously, tried the handle. "Locked," he observed, "but I see the key is in the lock, so we can get in if we want to. Let us try the back." The back door was locked too, but the key had been removed. "He came out this way, evidently," said Thorndyke, "though he went in at the front, as I suppose you noticed. Let us see where he went." The back garden was a small fenced patch of ground, with an earth path leading down to the back gate. A little way beyond the gate was a small barn or outhouse. "We are in luck," Thorndyke remarked with a glance at the path. "Yesterday's rain has cleared away all old footprints and prepared the surface for new ones. You see there are 3 sets of excellent impressions, 2 leading away from the house and 1 set towards it. Now you notice that both of the sets leading from the house are characterized by deep impressions and short steps, while the set leading to the house has lighter impressions and longer steps. The obvious inference is that he went down the path with a heavy burden, came back empty-handed, and went down again, and finally, with another heavy burden. You observe, too, that he walked with his stick on each occasion." By this time we had reached the bottom of the garden. Opening the gate, we followed the tracks towards the outhouse, which stood beside a cart track. But as we came round the corner, we both stopped short and looked at one another. On the soft earth were the very distinct impressions of the tyres of a motor car leading from the wide door of the outhouse. Finding that the door was unfastened, Thorndyke opened it and looked in, to satisfy himself that the place was empty. Then he fell to studying the tracks. "The course of events is pretty plain," he observed. "First the fellow brought down his luggage, started the engine, and got the car out. You can see where it stood, both by the little pool of oil and by the widening and blurring of the wheel tracks from the vibration of the free engine. Then he went back and fetched the boy, carried him pick-a-back, I should say, judging by the depth of the toe mark in the last set of footprints. That was a tactical mistake. He should have taken the boy straight into the shed." He pointed as he spoke to one of the footprints beside the wheel tracks, from the toe of which projected a small segment of the print of a little rubber heel. We now made our way back to the house, where we found Willett pensively rapping at the front door with a cycle spanner. Thorndyke took a last glance, with his hand in his pocket, at an open window above, and then, to the coachman's intense delight, brought forth what looked uncommonly like a small bunch of skeleton keys. One of these he inserted into the keyhole, and as he gave it a turn, the lock clicked, and the door stood open. The little sitting-room, which we now entered, was furnished with the barest necessaries. Its centre was occupied by an oilcloth-covered table, on which I observed with surprise a dismembered B clock, the works of which had been taken apart with a tin opener that lay beside them, and a boxwood bird-call. At these objects Thorndyke glanced and nodded, as though they fitted into some theory that he had formed, examined carefully the oilcloth around the litter of wheels and pinions, and then proceeded on a tour of inspection round the room, peering inquisitively into the kitchen and store-cupboard. "Nothing very distinctive or personal here," he remarked. "Let us go upstairs." There were 3 bedrooms on the upper floor, of which 2 were evidently disused, though the windows were wide open. The 3rd bedroom showed manifest traces of occupation, though it was as bare as the others, for the water still stood in the wash-hand basin, and the bed was unmade. To the latter Thorndyke advanced, and having turned back the bedclothes, examined the interior attentively, especially at the foot and the pillow. The latter was soiled, not to say grimy, though the rest of the bed linen was quite clean. "Hair dye," remarked Thorndyke, noting my glance at it. Then he turned and looked out of the open window. "Can you see the place where Miss Haldean was sitting to sketch?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "There is the place well in view, and you can see right up the road. I had no idea this house stood so high. From the 3 upper windows you can see all over the country excepting through the wood." "Yes," Thorndyke rejoined, "and he has probably been in the habit of keeping watch up here with a telescope or a pair of field-glasses. Well, there is not much of interest in this room. He kept his effects in a cabin trunk which stood there under the window. He shaved this morning. He has a white beard, to judge by the stubble on the shaving paper, and that is all. Wait, though. There is a key hanging on that nail. We must have overlooked that, for it evidently does not belong to this house. It is an ordinary town latch-key." He took the key down, and having laid a sheet of notepaper from his pocket on the dressing-table, produced a pin with which he began carefully to probe the interior of the key barrel. Presently there came forth, with much coaxing, a large ball of grey fluff, which Thorndyke folded up in the paper with infinite care. "I suppose we mustn't take away the key," he said, "but I think we will take a wax mould of it." He hurried downstairs, and unstrapping the case from his bicycle, brought it in and placed it on the table. As it was now getting dark, he detached the acetylene lamp from his machine, and having lighted it, proceeded to open the mysterious case. First he took from it a small insufflator, or powder blower, with which he blew a cloud of light yellow powder over the table around the remains of the clock. The powder settled on the table in an even coating, but when he blew at it smartly with his breath, it cleared off, leaving, however, a number of smeary impressions which stood out in strong yellow against the black oilcloth. To one of these impressions he pointed significantly. It was the print of a child's hand. He next produced a small portable microscope and some glass slides and cover slips, and having opened the paper and tipped the ball of fluff from the key barrel onto the slide, set to work with a pair of mounted needles to tease it out into its component parts. Then he turned the light of the lamp onto the microscope mirror and proceeded to examine the specimen. "A curious and instructive assortment this, Jervis," he remarked, with his eye at the microscope. "Woolen fibres, no cotton or linen. He is careful of his health to have woolen pockets. And 2 hairs, very curious ones too. Just look at them, and observe the root bulbs." I applied my eye to the microscope, and saw, among other things, 2 hairs, originally white, but encrusted with a black, opaque, glistening stain. The root bulbs, I noticed, were shriveled and atrophied. "But how on earth," I exclaimed, "did the hairs get into his pocket?" "I think the hairs themselves answer the question," he replied, "when considered with the other curios. The stain is obviously lead sulphide, but what else do you see?" "I see some particles of metal, a white metal apparently, and a number of fragments of woody fibre and starch granules, but I don't recognise the starch. It is not wheat starch, nor rice, nor potato. Do you make out what it is?" Thorndyke chuckled. "Experientia does it," he said. "You will have, Jervis, to study the minute properties of dust and dirt. Their evidential value is immense. Let us have another look at that starch. It is all alike, I suppose." It was, and Thorndyke had just ascertained the fact when the door burst open and Mrs. Haldean entered the room, followed by Mrs. Hanshaw and the police inspector. The former lady regarded my colleague with a glance of extreme disfavour. "We heard that you had come here, sir," she said, "and we supposed you were engaged in searching for my poor child. But it seems we were mistaken, since we find you here amusing yourself fiddling with these nonsensical instruments." "Perhaps, Mabel," said Mrs. Hanshaw stiffly, "it would be wiser and infinitely more polite to ask if Dr. Thorndyke has any news for us." "That is undoubtedly so, madam," agreed the inspector, who had apparently suffered also from Mrs. Haldean's impulsiveness. "Then perhaps," the latter lady suggested, "you will inform us if you have discovered anything." "I will tell you," replied Thorndyke, "all that we know. The child was abducted by the man who occupied this house, and who appears to have watched him from an upper window, probably through a glass. This man lured the child into the wood by blowing his bird call. He met him in the wood, and induced him, by some promises no doubt, to come with him. He picked the child up, and carried him, on his back I think, up to the house, and brought him in through the front door, which he locked after him. He gave the boy this clock and the bird call to amuse him while he went upstairs and packed his trunk. He took the trunk out through the back door and down the garden to the shed there, in which he had a motor car. He got the car out and came back for the boy, whom he carried down to the car, locking the back door after him. Then he drove away." "You know he has gone," cried Mrs. Haldean, "and yet you stay here playing with these ridiculous toys. Why are you not following him?" "We have just finished ascertaining the facts," Thorndyke replied calmly, "and should by now be on the road if you had not come." Here the inspector interposed anxiously. "Of course, sir, you can't give any description of the man. You have no clue to his identity, I suppose." "We have only his footprints," Thorndyke answered, "and this fluff which I raked out of the barrel of his latchkey and have just been examining. From these data I conclude that he is a rather short and thin man and somewhat lame. He walks with the aid of a thick stick, which has a knob, not a crook, at the top, and which he carries in his left hand. I think that his left leg has been amputated above the knee, and that he wears an artificial limb. He is elderly, he shaves his beard, has white hair dyed a greyish black, is partly bald, and probably combs a wisp of hair over the bald place. He takes snuff and carries a leaden comb in his pocket." As Thorndyke's description proceeded, the inspector's mouth gradually opened wider and wider, until he appeared the very type and symbol of astonishment. But its effect on Mrs. Haldean was much more remarkable. Rising from her chair, she leaned on the table and stared at Thorndyke with an expression of awe, even of terror, and as he finished, she sank back into her chair with her hands clasped and turned to Mrs. Hanshaw. "Jane!" she gasped. "It is Percy, my brother-in-law. He has described him exactly, even to his stick and his pocket-comb. But I thought he was in Chicago." "If that is so," said Thorndyke, hastily repacking his case, "we had better start at once." "We have the dog-cart in the road," said Mrs. Hanshaw. "Thank you," replied Thorndyke. "We will ride on our bicycles, and the inspector can borrow Willet's. We go out at the back by the cart track, which joins the road farther on." "Then we will follow in the dog-cart," said Mrs. Haldean. "Come, Jane." The two ladies departed down the path, while we made ready our bicycles and lit our lamps. With your permission, Inspector," said Thorndyke, "we will take the key with us." "It's hardly legal, sir," objected the officer. "We have no authority." "It is quite illegal," answered Thorndyke, "but it is necessary, and necessity, like your military J.P., knows no law." The inspector grinned and went out, regarding me with a quivering eyelid, as Thorndyke locked the door with his skeleton key. As we turned into the road, I saw the light of the dog-cart behind us, and we pushed forward at a swift pace, picking up the trail easily on the soft, moist road. "What beats me," said the inspector confidentially, as we rode along, "is how he knew the man was bald. Was it the footprints or the latchkey? And that comb, too, that was a regular knockout." These points were, by now, pretty clear to me. I had seen the hairs with the atrophied bulbs, such as one finds at the margin of a bald patch, and the comb was used, evidently, for the double purpose of keeping the bald patch covered and blackening the sulphur-charged hair. But the knobbed stick and the artificial limb puzzled me so completely that I presently overtook Thorndyke to demand his explanation. "The stick," said he, "is perfectly simple. The ferrule of a knobbed stick wears evenly all round. That of a crooked stick wears on one side, the side opposite the crook. The impressions showed that the ferrule of this one was evenly convex, therefore it had no crook. The other matter is more complicated. To begin with, an artificial foot makes a very characteristic impression owing to its purely passive elasticity, as I will show you tomorrow. But an artificial leg fitted below the knee is quite secure, whereas one fitted above the knee, that is, with an artificial knee joint worked by a spring, is much less reliable. Now this man had an artificial foot, and he evidently distrusted his knee joint, as is shown by his steadying it with his stick on the same side. If he had merely had a weak leg, he would have used the stick with his right hand, with the natural swing of the arm, in fact, unless he had been very lame, which he evidently was not. Still, it was only a question of probability, though the probability was very great. Of course, you understand that those particles of woody fibre and starch granules were disintegrated snuff grains. This explanation, like the others, was quite simple when one had heard it, though it gave me material for much thought as we pedalled on along the dark road, with Thorndyke's light flickering in front, and the dog-cart pattering in our wake. but there was ample time for reflection, for our pace rather precluded conversation, and we rode on, mile after mile, until my legs ached with fatigue. On and on we went, through village after village, now losing the trail in some frequented street, but picking it up again unfailingly as we emerged onto the country road, until at last, in the paved high street of the little town of Horsefield, we lost it for good. We rode on through the town, out on to the country road, but although there were several tracks of motors, Thorndyke shook his head at them all. "I have been studying those tyres until I know them by heart," he said. "No, either he is in the town, or he has left it by a side road." There was nothing for it but to put up the horse and the machines at the hotel, while we walked round to reconnoitre; and this we did, tramping up one street and down another, with eyes bent on the ground, fruitlessly searching for a trace of the missing car. Suddenly, at the back of a blacksmith's shop, Thorndyke halted. The shop had been kept open late for the shoeing of a carriage horse, which was just being led away, and the smith had come to the door for a breath of air. Thorndyke accosted him genially. "Good evening. You are just the man I wanted to see. I have mislaid the address of a friend of mine, who, I think, called on you this afternoon. A lame gentleman who walks with a stick. I expect he wanted you to pick a lock or make him a key." "Oh, I remember him," said the man. "Yes, he had lost his latchkey, and wanted the lock picked before he could get into his house. Had to leave his motor car outside while he came here, but I took some keys round with me, and fitted one to his latch." He then directed us to the house at the end of a street close by, and, having thanked him, we went off in high spirits. "How did you know he had been there?" I asked. "I didn't, but there was the mark of a stick and part of a left foot on the soft earth outside the doorway, and the thing was inherently probable, so I risked a false shot." The house stood alone at the far end of a straggling street, and was enclosed by a high wall, in which, on the side facing the street, was a door and a wide carriage gate. Advancing to the former, Thorndyke took from his pocket the purloined key, and tried it in the lock. It fitted perfectly, and when he had turned it and pushed open the door, we entered a small courtyard. Crossing this, we came to the front door of the house, the latch of which fortunately fitted the same key, and this having been opened by Thorndyke, we trooped into the hall. Immediately we heard the sound of an opening door above, and a reedy, nasal voice sang out, "Hello there! Who's that below?" The voice was followed by the appearance of a head projecting over the baluster rail. "You are Mr. Percy Haldean, I think?" said the inspector. At the mention of his name, the head was withdrawn, and a quick tread was heard, accompanied by the tapping of a stick on the floor. We started to ascend the stairs, the inspector leading, as the authorised official. But we had only gone up a few steps when a fierce, wiry little man danced out onto the landing, with a thick stick in one hand and a very large revolver in the other. "Move another step, either of you," he shouted, pointing the weapon at the inspector, "and I let fly, and mind you, when I shoot, I hit." He looked as if he meant it, and we accordingly halted with remarkable suddenness, while the inspector proceeded to parley. "Now what's the good of this, Mr. Haldean?" said he. "The game's up, and you know it." "You clear out of my house, and step out sharp," was the inhospitable rejoinder, "or you'll give me the trouble of burying you in the garden." I looked round to consult with Thorndyke, when, to my amazement, I found that he had vanished, apparently through the open hall door. I was admiring his discretion when the inspector endeavoured to reopen negotiations, but was cut short abruptly. "I'm going to count to 50, said Mr. Haldean, "and if you aren't gone then, I shall shoot." He began to count deliberately, and the inspector looked round at me in complete bewilderment. The flight of stairs was a long one, and well lighted by gas, so that to rush it was an impossibility. Suddenly my heart gave a bound and I held my breath, for out of an open door behind our quarry a figure emerged slowly and noiselessly onto the landing. It was Thorndyke, shoeless and in his shirt sleeves. Slowly and with cat-like stealthiness he crept across the landing until he was within a yard of the unconscious fugitive. and still the nasal voice droned on, monotonously counting out the allotted seconds. 41, 42, 43. There was a lightning-like movement, a shout, a flash, a bang, a shower of falling plaster, and then the revolver came clattering down the stairs. The inspector and I rushed up, and in a moment the sharp click of the handcuffs told Mr. Percy Haldane that the game was really up. 5 minutes later, Freddy boy, half asleep, but wholly cheerful, was borne by Thorndyke's shoulders into the private sitting-room of the Black Horse Hotel. A shriek of joy saluted his entrance, and a shower of maternal kisses brought him to the verge of suffocation. Finally, the impulsive Mrs. Haldane, turning suddenly to Thorndyke, seized both his hands, and for a moment I hoped that she was going to kiss him too. But he was spared, and I have not yet recovered from the disappointment. End of The Stranger's Latchkey by R. Austin Freeman.
"10 Minutes Musing" by Alice Ruth Moore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Monica Washington, Atlanta. There was a terrible noise in the schoolyard at intermission. Peeping out the windows, the boys could be seen, huddled in an immense bunch in the middle of the yard. It looked like a fight, a mob, a knockdown, anything. So we rushed out to the door, hastily, fearfully, ready to scold, punish, console, frown, bind up broken heads, or drag wounded forms from the melee, as the case might be. Nearly every boy in the school was in that seething, swarming mass, and those who weren't were standing around on the edges, screaming, throwing up their hats in hilarious excitement. It was a mob, a fearful mob, but a mob apparently with a vigorous and well-defined purpose. It was a mob that screamed and howled and kicked and yelled and shouted and perspired and squirmed and wriggled and pushed and threatened and poured itself all seemingly upon some central object. It was a mob that had an aim, that was determined to accomplish that aim, even though the whole azure expanse of sky fell upon them. It was a mob with set muscles, straining like whipcords, eyes on that central object, and with heads inward and sturdy legs outward, like prairie horses, reversed in a battle. The cheerers and hat throwers on the outside were mirthful, but the mob was not. It howled, but howled without any cachinnation. It struggled for mastery. Some fell and were trampled over, some weaker ones were even tossed in the air. But the mob never deigned to trouble itself about such trivialities. It was an interesting nervous whole, with diverse parts of separate vitality. In alarm, I looked about for the principal. He was standing at a safe distance with his hands in his pockets, watching the seething mass with a broad smile. At sight of my perplexed expression, someone was about to venture an explanation when there was a wild yell, a sudden vehement disintegration of the mass, a mighty rush and clutch at a dark object bobbing in the air, and the mist cleared from my intellect as I realized it all. Football. Did you ever stop to see the analogy between a game of football and the interesting little game called life, which we play every day? There is one, far-fetched as it may seem, though, for that matter. Life's game, being one of desperate chances and strategic moves, is analogous to anything. But if we could get out of ourselves and soar above the world far enough to view the mass beneath in its daily struggles, and near enough the hearts of the people to fear the throbs beneath their boldly carried exteriors, the whole would seem naught but such a maddening rush and senseless-looking crushing. We are but children of a larger growth after all, and our ceaseless pursuing after the baubles of this earth are but the struggles for precedence in the business playground. The football is money. See how the mass rushes after it? everyone so intent upon his pursuit until all else dwindles into a ridiculous nonentity. The weaker ones go down in the mad pursuit and are unmercifully trampled upon, but no matter. What is the difference if the foremost wins the coveted prize and carry it off? See the big boy in front? He with iron grip and determined compressed lips? That boy is a type of the big, merciless man, the Gradgrind of the latter century. His face is set towards the ball, and even though he may crush a dozen small boys, he'll make his way through the mob and come out triumphant. And he'll be the victor longer than anyone else, in spite of the envy and fighting and pushing about him. To an observer, alike unintelligent about the rules of a football game and the conditions which govern the barter and exchange and fluctuations of the world's money market, there is as much difference between the sight of a mass of boys on a playground losing their equilibrium over a spheroid of rubber and a mass of men losing their coolness and temper and mental and nervous balance on change as there is between a pine sapling and a mighty forest king, merely a difference of age. The mighty, seething, intensely concentrated mass in its emphatic tendency to one point is the same, and the utter disregard of mental and physical welfare. The momentary triumphs of transitory possessions impress a casual looker-on with the same fearful idea that the human race, after all, is savage to the core, and cultivates its savagery in an inflated happiness at own nearness to perfection. But the bell clangs sharply, the overheated, nervous, tingling boys fall into line, and the sudden transition from massing disorder to military precision cuts short the 10 minutes musing. End of 10 Minutes Musing by Alice Ruth Moore.
The Two Foxes, the Mole, and the Crows by Basil Hall Chamberlain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. The Two Foxes, the Mole, and the Crows from Aino Folktales by Basil Hall Chamberlain. Two brother foxes consulted together thus: "It would be fun for us to go down among men and assume human shape." So they made treasures, and they made garments out of the leaves of various trees, and they made various things to eat, and cakes out of the gum which comes out of trees. But the mole god saw them making all these preparations, so the mole made a place like a human village, and placed himself in it under the disguise of a very old man. The foxes came to that village. They came to the very old man's house, and the mole himself made beautiful treasures and made garments out of various herbs and leaves of trees, and taking mulberries and grapes from the tops of the trees, he made good food. On the arrival of the foxes, the mole invited all the crows in the place and all sorts of birds. He gave them human shape, and placed them as owners in the houses of the village. Then the mole, as chief of the village, was a very old man. Then the foxes came, having assumed the shape of men. They thought the place was a human village. The old chief bought all the things which the foxes had brought on their backs, all their treasures and all their food. Then the old man displayed to them his own beautiful treasures. The old man displayed all his beautiful things, his garments. The foxes were much pleased. Then the old man spoke thus: "Oh, you strangers, as there is a dance in my village, it will be well for you to see it." Then all the people in the village danced all sorts of dances, but at last, owing to their being birds, they began to fly upwards, notwithstanding their human shape. The foxes saw this, and were much amused. The foxes ate both of the mulberries and of the grapes. They tasted very good. It was great fun, too, to see the dancing. Afterwards they went home. The foxes thought thus: "What is nicer even than treasures is the delicious food which human beings have. As we do not know what it is, let us go again and buy some more of it." So they again made treasures out of herbs. Then they again went down to the village. The mole was in a golden house, a large house. He was alone in it, having sent all the crows and the rest away. As the foxes entered the house and looked about them, they saw a very venerable god. The god spoke thus: "O you foxes, because you had assumed human shape, you made all sorts of counterfeit treasures. I saw all that you did. It is by me, and because of this, that you were brought here. You think this is a human village, but it is the village of me, your master, the mole. It seems you constantly do all sorts of bad things. If you do so, it is very wrong, so do not assume human shape any more. If you will cease to assume human shape, you may henceforth eat your fill of these mulberries and grapes. You and your companions the crows may eat together of the mulberries and of all fruits at the top of the trees, which the crows cause to drop down. This will be much more profitable for you than to assume human shape." Thus spoke the mole. Owing to this, the foxes left off assuming human shape, and from that time forward ate as they pleased of the mulberries and the grapes. When the crows let any drop, they went underneath the trees and ate them. They became very friendly together. Translated literally. Told by Ishanashit, 11th November, 1886. End of The Two Foxes, the Mole, and the Crows, by Basil Hall Chamberlain.